this workshop. We welcome again Margarida Hermida for a talk entitled The Modal Structure of Biology. Is it okay, Hazel?
Okay, thank you very much to all of you who stayed until the end. I really appreciate it. So, I'm afraid I'm going to give a little bit of a work in progress, but hopefully it will be useful for me if you have nice comments, and hopefully you'll find it interesting as well. So, I'm going to talk about biological modality. So what is that? And is there such a thing to start with? So plausibly, biological modality is a restricted modality. It's a restricted broader modality. And so restricted modalities are typically defined in terms of a domain-specific restriction, either of metaphysical, nomic, or more plausibly perhaps physical modality. Now, I had a bunch of these pictures, so I'm not committed to this particular picture, so it might also be the case that there is actually no difference between metaphysical modality and nomological modality, depending on whether you think that, for example, laws of nature are necessary. And it might also be the case that physical modality is not actually a subset of nomological modality, but it's all of it. So, regardless, biological modality seems to be a more restricted part of this modal space. So, is it simply a restriction of physical modality? And are there any biological laws that could justify it? Or are evolutionary outcomes contingent? Well, I'm going to argue that biology has a rich modal structure that includes physical necessity, a bit surprisingly, biological necessity, probability, laws, equilibria, and various different possibility spaces that interact in interesting ways with historical contingency. I might not have time to talk about all of these, but I'll try to say a little bit about each of them. So consider an organism. There are some features of an organism that are explained by physical necessity, meaning that they could not have been otherwise due to physical laws, physical necessity. So, for example, an organism cannot do work without expending free energy and dissipating heat. That's not a special feature of organisms, it's due to thermodynamics. Some other features of organisms are going to be due to biological necessity. So, for example, it's perfectly physically possible for all the components of a cell to be located on the outside of the cell membrane. That's physically possible arrangement, but it's not compatible with life. So I want to say that that's not a biological possibility. And then many other features of an organism are going to be contingent. So they're neither physically nor biologically necessary. They could have been otherwise. But how contingent are they? So some of them, many of them, could easily have been different if only evolutionary history had gone slightly differently. The other ones are going to be overwhelmingly unlikely to be any other way, based on how natural selection actually works. Because any possible alternatives would just be so much less efficient at carrying out the relevant task that selection would have got rid of it. Now that's still contingent, but a lot less so, perhaps. And then most features are going to lie on this continuum of probability. Right, so let's start with physical necessity. Why do I say that there is physical necessity in biology? So if physical laws apply to biological and non-biological systems, they obviously impose some constraints on biological modality. Ladyman and Ross say that from the point of view of those engaged in special science activity, fundamental physics gives the modal structure of the world. Now, maybe, okay, maybe that is so, but it's not enough. So there are some aspects of fundamental physics that are definitely, so fundamental physics, or quantum physics if you like, definitely constrains what is the modal structure of the world. And so it does constrain biology, but lots of other physical laws at various scales are actually a lot more important for biology than quantum physics specifically. And they are important both in terms of how they constrain, but also how they enable the functioning of biological systems. So there are at least 4 different ways in which physical laws are crucial for evolution. So most obviously, physical necessity constrains biological possibilities, so nothing can evolve if it's not physically possible. But physical laws are also directly involved in the selective forces facing biological lineages. And here I could give any example of that. I'm going to go with one that I just recently read about and I thought it was really interesting. So apparently increased water viscosity due to lower temperature in so-called snowball Earth events may have been a trigger for the evolution of multicellularity in those lineages that were already above a certain size threshold. On the other hand, the relationship between the morphology of an organism, or its physical structure, and its fitness, which is what is important in evolution, occurs via the organism's performance in the tasks under selection, which is often, if not always, going to be its physical performance at those tasks, like flying. And then organisms themselves make use of physical laws to enable their functioning and the functioning of their parts and solve the problems they're faced with. And again, this is pretty obvious because what else could they make use of? Right? So an example I really like is the example of water transport in trees, because it's a case where you can see that there are different lineages of plants, 9 separate lineages of plants, have converged, and they solved a problem that arises from the existence of one physical force, namely gravity, so in this case, the problem of how to get water up to the leaves against gravity, by using another physical force, which is the electromagnetic attraction between water molecules. So basically, they evaporate water in the leaves and they pull along a string of water molecules. And you do also find relevant quantum physical principles at work within biological systems. In particular, electron tunneling in respiration and photosynthesis, which is kind of important because it's the stuff that's keeping us alive. Okay, so what about more specifically biological necessity? Well, I think there is that too. So here's what some people have said about biological necessity. A proposition's being biologically necessary consists in its being metaphysically or conceptually necessitated by the laws of biology. What's biologically necessary is what must be so given the actual laws of biology or the nature of living organisms. Biological necessity can be defined as the property of being metaphysically or perhaps nomically necessitated by the basic principles of biology, and one can take biological laws to restrict possibilities left open by physical laws. I had never seen so many people talk about biological laws outside of this context. So the problem here is that, well, many people just think that there aren't any biological laws. So that might be a bit of a problem for biological necessity. So people argue that biological generalizations are just contingent evolutionary outcomes that lack any nomic necessity. or at best, they're contingent frozen accidents that can still support some counterfactuals. And that would seem to imply that, strictly speaking, there isn't such a thing as biological necessity. There's just physical necessity plus evolutionary history. Now, that's one possible view. I don't think that's right. So, one way would be to argue that there are actually biological laws. I have to admit, I'm on the fence about this. I sometimes think there are, but I'm not entirely sure. Another way is just to say that there is biological necessity, even if there aren't any biological laws, purely in virtue of the nature of biological entities or relations or processes and so on. Like the nature of life, the nature of organisms, and the nature of species is such that it has some normative force. So, starting with the second one, ways things have to be biologically in virtue of the nature of living things. So, the first example is viability. So, the viability is the restriction of what is physically possible to what is compatible with life. So, it's what must be so for something to be alive. And Walters points out that biologists often engage in this kind of explanation that is not causal, it's not evolutionary, which is viability explanation, which is a kind of explanation that explains the need for certain traits of an organism, given certain other traits and its environment. So an example of that is the explanation of why flatworms are flat. So flatworms, like other animals, need oxygen for respiration, but they have no circulatory system, so they rely on diffusion to get oxygen to their cells. Now, given Fick's law of diffusion, and given the coefficient of oxygen in animal tissue and the partial pressure of oxygen in water, it turns out that if you have a flatworm that is thicker than 1 millimeter, oxygen would not diffuse fast enough to maintain cellular respiration. Or in other words, flatworms thicker than 1 millimeter would not be viable. So they have to be flat. That's a viability explanation. So this is a distinctly modal kind of biological explanation, and it derives its explanatory from biological necessity by identifying constraints on what kind of objects can be alive. And I think we should distinguish between absolute and relative viability, where absolute viability would be just the restriction of the physically possible to anything that is compatible with life. So, for example, an object cannot be alive if it has no means of acquiring free energy for metabolic activity under any environmental conditions whatsoever. That's just not possible. Whereas relative viability corresponds to Walter's notion, where it explains the need for a particular trait given other traits of the same organism and its environment. So, yeah, this is just the same thing, but the other way around. So viability, I think, is explained on the basis of the nature of life and on the basis of physical laws. Okay. One other kind of biological necessity that I have actually argued for in the past is a biologically specific necessity of origin, which I call biological antecedents essentialism. And it's the idea that organisms could not have originated in different biological antecedents, by which I mean the actual organisms and or cells from which they originated. So lots of people agree that you could not have originated from different parents or from different gametes. But Kripke thought that this case, just like the case of this table, could not have been made from a different block of wood, instantiate the same more general principle, which is a material origin essentialism principle, that says that if a material object has its origin in a certain hunk of matter, then it could not have had its origin in any other matter. I think it's very implausible that it's material composition that determines identity. Firstly, because the gametes are living cells and they continuously change their material composition over time. Secondly, because material composition does not generally determine the identity of organisms at any point during their lives. And thirdly, because it's impossible to pinpoint the exact moment in time when the organism begins to exist. Even if you think in conception, it's still a process that takes time. And it's also implausible that the identity of the gametes can be reduced to genetic information. Furthermore, gametes transmit not just genes, but they transmit actively functional physical structures like cellular structures, cell membrane, mitochondria, etc., that are necessary for life. So biological antecedents essentialism, of which gametic essentialism is a particular case, does not reduce either to material origin essentialism or to genetic essentialism. It's actually the numerical identity of the gametes as living cells that could not have been different. So I think that this kind of necessity is justified on the basis of the metaphysical nature of organisms as objects that inherit life from previously existing living organisms. And here's another view I've also previously argued for, but in this case it's a contingency view, which is the contingency of taxon membership. So organisms do not belong necessarily to the species they belong to, and this has been argued before. And I think that this also applies to the higher taxa they belong to. Why is this? Well, on any biological species concept, at least the currently accepted ones, species membership always depends on relational properties rather than intrinsic ones. And this means that organisms do not belong essentially to their species. They could, if things had gone slightly differently, our species, for example, might have undergone a speciation event in the past, and we might have found ourselves either on this side or on that side. So we could have been this species or that one. And this is also true of organisms' ancestors, since phylogenetic groups like the animal kingdom or the mammals are composed of an ancestral stem species plus all of its descendants. If the stem species had not existed, then neither would the clade or the phylogenetic group. So all the organisms that actually belong to the animal kingdom might have existed and not have been animals in a possible world where there is no such thing as the animal kingdom due to contingently different evolutionary history. So cats are not necessarily animals. This is a modal claim that is justified on the basis of the nature of species and phylogenetic groups. The other alternative is to say, well, maybe there are biological laws. By which I mean true non-contingent universal biological generalizations. Now, a lot of people think that there aren't any biological laws because most things that have been discussed as putative examples of biological laws are really nothing of the kind. So things like the philosopher's toy example of all ravens are black, no one ever thought that was a law. These are just distribution statements, as Kenneth Waters says. What would be some candidates for biological laws? Well, the main candidate that even people who don't like biological laws think might be one is the principle of natural selection, or Lewontin's three conditions for evolution by natural selection, or perhaps the price equation, however you like to frame it. I think the central dogma, as originally formulated by Crick, is a candidate for a biological law. Lots of people claim that it has been falsified, but that's just not true if you look at the actual original formulation. Ecological scaling laws are also good candidates, perhaps. And in general, universal generalizations that are not about spatiotemporally restricted biological groups like taxa, but are about universal biological kinds like life, cell, organism, photosynthetic organism, are good candidates for biological laws. I'm not going to press the point, but I think it's plausible. Okay, so now for biological possibility spaces. So Dennett is one of the few people who has specifically discussed biological possibility, and he thought it was best seen in terms of accessibility from what he called the library of Mendel, which is this abstract logical space of all genomes. So X is biologically possible if and only if X is an instantiation of an accessible genome or a feature of its phenotypic products. At least two problems with this. So one is, it doesn't strike me as sufficiently general. So I think we can perfectly conceive that life without DNA might be possible. Why think only in terms of genomes? Secondly, accessibility comes in degrees, but possibility is usually understood to be all or nothing. And this is a point that Dennett acknowledges, but he says, well, perhaps degree of accessibility in the space of the library of Mendel is what we need. Perhaps that's better than having this all or nothing version of possibility. Marcel Weber also argues that there is this intuition that whatever biological possibility is, it must be relative to a given organism or lineage, and it must come in degrees. But again, I don't think that's broad enough. So I think that there may be biological possibilities that are never accessible. And not all biological possibilities are relative to an organism or lineage. Some of them are, but some of them are not. So I think we should go back a little bit and start by considering biological possibility spaces for life. And here, the broadest possible space of biological possibilities would be just what is possible for life in general, given just physical possibility plus the nature of life. So this would be the global space of biological possibility for this world. One concept in astrobiology that is distinctly modal is the concept of habitability, so whether a planet has abiotic conditions for the presence of life. And then, even if a planet is habitable, whether or not it has the conditions for the origin of life, which, by the way, we don't know exactly what they are, but we think that they're probably more constrained than just habitability. And then we might consider what's biologically possible for a particular kind of life. Suppose that it is possible for there to be carbon-based life. Well, that definitely is, because it's actual. Suppose it's also possible for there to be silicon-based life. Well, DNA, proteins, and ribosomes, we know, are possible for carbon-based life, but they're not possible for silicon-based life, even if that kind of life is possible. And then we should also consider what is biologically possible for a particular instance of life. So suppose that it was possible for either carbon-based life or silicon-based life to originate on Earth. It probably wasn't, but suppose it was. But once carbon-based life actually originated, then it's just that having a silicon-based biochemistry is just not possible for it ever again. That's permanently closed. So this brings us to possibility spaces that are relative to a biological lineage, just like Dennett wanted to have. And here the main notion, I think, is the notion of evolvability, which I understand as the ability or capacity or disposition or propensity of a biological lineage to evolve in response to directional selection. So evolvability, I think, is well understood as accessibility from within a lineage. So for example, it's perfectly possible for animals to have 4, 6, 8, or even 400 limbs. We know those are possible because they're actual. But evolving a different number of limbs might not be accessible from within a particular lineage. So for example, tetrapod lineages can lose one set of limbs. They can also lose both pairs of limbs, like snakes. But many people have argued that it's just not possible at this time for tetrapods to evolve 6 limbs instead of 4. I don't know if that's true or not, but if it is, then that would be an evolvability issue. So it would be a case of you can't get there from here. It was possible at some point, but right now it's not. And access to the space of evolutionary possibilities itself evolves over time. And lots of people emphasize how evolutionary pathways can become permanently closed due to developmental constraints and generative entrenchment and all that sort of thing. But it's also the case that new evolutionary pathways can open. And in particular, if you look at the major transitions in evolution, you can see how, for example, eukaryotes in metabolic terms got stuck with very little, metabolic diversity, but especially after the transition to multicellularity, the morphological and diversification options were amazing. So, yeah. So here's an example of an explanation that has to do with accessibility. So why are rotating structures for locomotion, like wheels, for example, very uncommon in nature? Well, the traditional explanation is it's very difficult to supply nutrients to a rotating joint, but this can actually be overcome. Well, bacteria don't have that problem because they're very small, so they can just rely on diffusion. Or you can just do away with the rotating joints. There are also mechanical limitations of wheels that make them really useless for most natural environments that don't have roads. So any obstacle is really a tremendous obstacle. But also, wheel transport is very inefficient at small scales. And ask me about this afterwards if you want to know more details, but life must always start small. And because of that, but wheel transport is only going to be useful for large organisms. But then by the time you get to large organisms, they are already set on a particular body plan, and they're not going to have access to those alternative morphologies that would allow them to have wheels. So they're stuck with having limbs, which actually works pretty well. So the biologically possible is constrained by the need to preserve the life of all the organisms that would live in that transition from this particular feature to the other one that could evolve from there. So if getting from one viable form to another would require you to transition through a lethal form, or even something that would just be incredibly inefficient, you're probably not going to, that other form is probably not going to be accessible. And so, Marcel Weber argues, and hence that's not a biological possibility. Even though the resulting end form may itself be viable. And these constraints on possibility result from taking an evolutionary perspective and would not arise if you take a physical or a chemical perspective. Well, yeah, but they would also not arise from taking a more general biological perspective. If something is viable, then it is biologically possible. It's just not evolvable. It's not accessible from here. But it is possible. And in fact, many things that would have been considered impossible just a few years ago are actual. Like, for example, plants that glow in the dark in virtue of having firefly genes in them. We made those. So it would be kind of weird to say that something is biologically impossible when it's actual. Right? What we mean is that it's not evolvable. So, bottom line, there's more to biological possibility than evolvability. And so we should also consider non-evolvable biological possibilities, and synthetic biology is a great way to investigate those. So synthetic biology can demonstrate possibilities by actualizing them, and it allows biologists to explore systems that would not be evolutionarily accessible. So for example, Earth life is probably stuck forever with its actual genetic code. It's too late to change it. But we know for a fact that it is possible to have a genetic code with 8 bases instead of 4. It can be transcribed to RNA. It meets the structural requirements. It works. We know that because people have made that. And then we should also consider possibility spaces of an individual organism at a time in an environment, such as, for example, developability or developmental possibility. So during development, there are many developmental possibilities that are open to an organism, but then development must actually follow one particular path. So other options become permanently closed. So an example of this is when a young frog, while it's a tadpole, must decide, so to speak, whether to grow larger or to mature quicker. So it's more advantageous to mature and get out of the lake if there are a lot of predators. So what frogs do is they have a system for detecting some chemicals in the water that signal the presence of predators. If there are a lot of those, mature quicker. If not, then grow more. Once it activates one of the pathways, that's it. So more generally, life history trade-offs like that one are modal. They involve the possibility of activating different strategies under different circumstances. And it's precisely having these different possibilities that is advantageous for the organism, rather than just doing one of them. And then we should also think about physiological possibility and behavioral possibility and so on, but I'm not going to get into that. How much time? Very little.
2 minutes.
2 minutes, great, fantastic. So, how contingent are evolutionary outcomes? So, I've already said this. So some things are more contingent than others, or at least they are more likely than others. And some of them are a lot more likely than others. When you have, for example, as in the case of trees, convergent evolution on exactly the same design feature, this is an example from Carl Nicholas, which is that whenever trees are, the mechanisms for strengthening a tree trunk use the same, place the strengthening bits in the same location, which is just underneath the outside layer, because that's the best way to do it. So multiple tree lineages have converged on the same solution to the same problem. That's strong evidence against contingency. Well, that's some evidence against contingency, but it would be a lot better if we had alien trees to compare with. Unfortunately, we don't. So design explanations include both constraints on what can be alive, which is viability, but also probability. So some things working so much better than others. is going to be a reason to expect that there are going to be a lot more of those. And maybe none at all of the ones that work really not that well. So I think probability is also modal. And I think that many things are possible, but they're incredibly unlikely and we should not expect to find them. And this is also a modal feature of biology, especially when you have compounded improbabilities. So I've already mentioned silicon-based life. So it is widely accepted to be a possibility. Now, Charles Cockel points out that if silicon was just as good as carbon for biochemistry, you should expect carbon-based life to be 20 times more common just on the basis of the relative abundance of the two elements. But it's actually not as good. It's a lot worse. And then water is also very abundant in the universe. And water with carbon is really good for making complex biochemistry, whereas water with silicon is really good for making rocks. So if you compound all of these added improbabilities, you end up with the expectation that maybe we're going to find carbon-based life, not much else. And I'm going to leave it at that.
Chen.
Me first? Okay.
I'm sorry, Chen,
Oh, yeah.
Philippe. We'll get there.
Okay, also,
So start from the left, okay. Go.
okay, I have a biology question.
Oh,
So,
And
uh, So what you said about evolutionary possibilities being eliminated as systems evolve, you no longer get there from here. If that's true, that points a remarkable respect in which biology is different from many physical theories, and that evolution is not time reversible and variant, as you can't unevolve stuff. And I was wondering whether that's true. So that the reptiles and the first, they went through all the hassle of evolving limbs and then unevolved them.
Yeah.
So can we imagine a scenario where these kind of multi-cell organisms in response to the right sort of selective pressure kind of unevolve back to single-cell organisms, for example. And then things change and I don't go from the lizard back to the single organism, we come back as a chimpanzee or something.
Yes, I think you're right. So I don't think that new biological possibilities appear that didn't exist before, and biological possibilities that existed cease to exist. What I think happens is that you get things that are a lot more accessible or a lot less accessible. And you're right, it's not impossible to unevolve stuff. And it's extremely unlikely that you would unevolve something and then re-evolve it again exactly in the same way. It's not, strictly speaking, impossible, but it would be incredibly unlikely.
So it's not, you can't get there from here, but it's very, very far.
It's very, very far. So, in fact, you're not going to get there from here. But theoretically, you could. It's not, you're right. So, I do want to say that evolvability is not the same as biological possibility. It is part of biological possibility, but there's more to biological possibility than just evolvability. Evolvability is about accessibility.
Thank you.
Chen?
Sorry, I'm not quite sure if I get you right, but it seems to me that the biological necessity here restricts the physical possibility to what is compatible with life. And right? So
No, you have everything, you have all the space of physical possibility. And then within all the things that are physically possible, only some of them are compatible with life.
yes,
Right, that's it.
and yeah, so
Okay.
yeah, but so I'm not quite sure what's the model status of this constraint of being compatible with life. So is it a metaphysical necessity nomological necessity or just a content sensitive epistemic norm. I have this question because I'm a bit confused regarding the case of the collapse of the possibility of the biochemistry of the silicon-based life.
So I'm calling it biological necessity, and I think it's nomological.
Okay, that makes more sense for me.
Yeah. Okay, good.
Yeah, thank you a lot for the very lovely talk. There's two things really. Like Cristina Villegas and I wrote a little something on dispositions in biology that might be relevant to this. So, do you know her at all, Cristina Villegas?
I'm not sure, but I read something about
yeah.
dispositions in biology. I'm not sure if it was that.
It could be, but anyway,
What is it? Was it about evolvability?
Yeah, we talk about evolvability
Okay.
and so on. It's
And
called
when-
an epistemic argument for dispositions in biology. It's really about the epistemic side of things, right? And we use the case of evolvability and fitness. And,
Yeah.
So that was one thing. The other thing is I was wondering whether this picture of different types of biological modalities, right, is sort of caught up in the idea that you always have to define the sphere of possibilities first, or the possibility space, right? And you do that usually by restricting some kind of necessity, like the spheres picture, right? But in many of these cases, it might be more fruitful to just worry about the diamonds and not the boxes. So you might just do everything, but not worry about the boxes so much, right? Like in cases of what you really have is in open spaces of things that can grow and grow and grow and you can be accessed. But really, there's nothing in the class that naturally is a necessity or something like that. And that might be maybe fruitful to think about some of these kinds of biological modalities. That was just a thought I had while I was listening to your talk.
Right. So first of all, about the dispositions, I have read that, and I have another paper that I did not talk about,
Okay.
which is about life being a dispositional property of certain physical structures.
Cool.
Which I think is a plausible view, but I didn't think it fit in here. So I'm not sure that you can just focus on the diamonds and forget about the boxes. I think that one is related to the other. So the reason that some things are possible is because they're not forbidden, they're not impossible, because there are certain things that need to be the case.
Right.
So perhaps you could, and some of those things have to be the case due to physical necessity, and some of them have to be the case due to biological necessity, I think. But even if you think that they have to be the case just because of physical necessity, that still has to be there. So I don't think you can just...
Yeah, no, I was wondering actually of a picture where, yes, you do have these kind of constraints, right, like general constraints, but really what defines the biological kind of modality as such, right, isn't really any kind of restrictor, just more like kinds of accessibility things that you get out. So it's really that the possibility is the primary notion, not so much the constraint, right? And I'm not saying this will be the case for all of these biological modalities either, right? Like just in some cases, like for example, evolvability, right? Like what would be the evolvable space, right? Well, maybe there isn't a set of constraints that will give you all the things that are evolvable, right?
Well, there is a set of constraints that will give you all the things that are... Well, there is a set of constraints that means that the space of everything that is evolvable can't be outside of those constraints. For example, if something is physically impossible, it's never going to evolve. It just...
Sure, but that was sort of the thing to question, right?
Okay. But, sorry, could I just...
Oh, because I thought you
Okay,
were
go
saying
ahead,
the
go
same thing to
Yeah,
right, sorry, go ahead.
So, yeah, that's understood. You think this is stage first, he thinks the diamond is first. Not sure we will reconcile that in the next 2 minutes, but I could be wrong. Marco.
Okay, I know that I cannot let him repeat the stuff. So thank you so for your presentation, and I just have a question concerning how can we visualize these kind of possibilities, because for me, it's kind of, for example, in evolution, we have this closure of possibility, but from one side to the other side, we are open of possibility. And this, it seems to me that it's in evolution. And so the first question is, do we need a dynamic view of possibility, and do we can we use a dynamic space of possibility, or it's also relevant in this in evolution, or maybe more in development, that we need a possible pathway, trajectories.
Yeah.
And because for the development, it seems to me that we are talking more about the different pathway, the trajectory, or this trajectory that the frog can do this, does this or the other, but nonetheless are possible, but a bit constrained. It seems to me that less dynamics, even if possible. Instead of evolution, it seems to me that is more, the space is more dynamical. And I would like to know, this is my intuition about possibility space, possible trajectories. How could you visualize, even also only for try to understand because we are talking a lot about possibility claims, so this is possible, etc., but could be useful to visualize.
Yeah.
What is your opinion about that, your idea?
So if you think of possibility in terms of accessibility to pathways at a time in an environment, then it's not really that different for the developmental possibilities of an organism versus the evolvability possibilities of a population. The reason why the space of evolutionary possibilities is a lot broader or more open, if you like, is because you are considering a lineage. So you are considering the possibility. So it's one thing if you're considering what possibilities, what are its possible evolutionary pathways right now, right here, considering its actual location, versus what this lineage could do in the far future. So obviously that is going to be a lot broader. Whereas, and there's another reason why the developmental one is less open, which is that it's because it's the development of an organism that involves, that has a limited amount of genetic information to draw from, and a limited amount of environmental information to draw from as well. It still has a lot of possibilities, but they are a lot more limited. Again, this is not so different if you consider just a lineage at a time in an environment, but if you consider the whole, so the evolutionary pathways that will be open to it start to broaden as soon as you move, as you start moving forward from this particular point in time, depending on what environmental pressures are there going to be and what mutations will arise, and right, so.
So, sorry, follow up. Do you think then that you can, so it seems to me that you are saying that you can visualize both kind of possibility, evolutionary and developmental possibility with the same tools,
Yeah.
or the same concept, only we have kind of zoom in, zoom out concerning the lineage,
Yes.
or the development, so we can use the same tools.
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah, I love the talk. I think you're right in raising all these interesting words of modality. It's related to the last few questions you got, because it seems to me that since we have mutations, there are variations in the environment, and given the temporal span of evolution, it's, can we really say that there are certain possibilities that are closed, right? Sure, we evolve with two limbs, right?
Yeah.
Then we have a mutation, and because some develop a third leg. And it turns out that, these people are very good. They work well, and they start running well, they reproduce. And what in principle will prevent that, right? So can we really say, look, this is not possible?
So I don't know if we can say that. A lot of biologists have said that, and have said things like, there are certain developmental constraints that mean that you can't have X number of limbs. You must have, because we're bilateral, we must have 2 pairs of limbs. You can't have 3 limbs. That's not going to be developmentally stable or something like that. It's the specific body plan of bilateria means that you're always going to have limbs in pairs, for example. I don't know if that's true, and I don't know if we can know that that's true for a fact.
Yeah. Because again, it seems that there is a selection effect, right?
Yes. Yes, and that's a really important thing. And actually, recently, James DeFrisco pointed out that a lot of things that people call developmental constraints, those developmental constraints are also a form of selection. They're developmental constraints because it's not because those things can't exist, it's because they don't live very long,
That's right.
usually.
Yeah.
So,
Pastor?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, really, loads of interesting things to think about. Just on the kind of like link with the metaphysics stuff, where those people like Clement and so on are talking about laws of biology, and then there's a bit of a worry, but like, what, there aren't any. I mean, I think the preliminary case you made that there are, after all, laws of biology is actually quite a promising one. But I also don't think you kind of need it to fit into their frameworks, because they're using law in a kind of metaphysician sort of way, where if what you were talking about when you talked about the nature of things like life, just a statement of the nature of life is going to count as a law from their perspective. That's like, Clement would recognize that as a law that you could plug into that framework. So the fact that biologists don't call those things laws and maybe have a higher standard to call something a law of biology, I don't think it means that you kind of can't have that, you can't use those sorts of metaphysicians' characterizations of the link between modality and law to get what you want. So I think you don't need to hang that project on identifying genuine laws. Just statements of the nature of things would be enough.
I agree, I agree. I do want to make the case that even if you don't have laws, you still have lots of biological modality,
Yeah, but I think that, the metaphysicians would just call those statements things. I mean, maybe there is like the possibility of skepticism. There is even such a thing as the nature of life. Like if you deny that there is even like anything universal to be said at all about life, then maybe you're in trouble. But I think you made a pretty good case there was.
And I do want to make the case that there are universal things you can say about life as well.
And I actually need to run off.
A short last one.
Thanks for staying.
Yeah, I think I was thinking about kind of statements of biology, and it struck me how similar it really is to thermodynamics. I think that thermodynamics is very reducible to statistical mechanics, minus some of the religious. And isn't something similar happening here? Think about what happens, just as a gas expands into the available volume and with overwhelming likelihood, but then doesn't expand back, very likely expand back. What we have in the biological system, we start out with life, and then it slowly expands into all the ecological niches in a way. Right? So we start out with single cells, and then we start differentiating, and then once we're in a certain state, you have to kind of fit into all you have to find the extra niche somewhere. And it's a little bit like gas expansion, which kind of goes one way, and that doesn't go the other way. Yeah, it could, but it's exceedingly unlikely given.
Well, in some ways, but there are cases of, for example, decreases in complexity. So that sort of thing is not impossible.
But it's a little bit like with the gas. If you change the external constraint, you change the volume. The size of the box the gas is in, and it readjusts, but it seems that the evolutionary system does something kind of broadly similar, that responds to external constraint by then making most of what it has left.
I think it's more that the time evolution of the system is going to generally not go back exactly exactly the same way, just because it's extremely unlikely. But yeah, you're right, that you could make a parallel with thermodynamics, for sure.
Let's thank you.